How fast can Donald Trump use the Supreme Court to expand the conservative agenda in America? He took the first step in nominating Neil Gorsuch to the High Court just last week, and you already know what's at stake and the politics behind it all. You may remember President Obama didn't even get a hearing for his pick, Merrick Garland, and now Republicans seem to hold all the cards to confirm this Trump selection and future ones that could truly turn the court to the right.
Here to help us break it all down and talk about the potential effect on New York City are two Brooklyn Law School professors. Bill Araiza is also Vice Dean of the Law School and clerked for Justice David Souter. Thanks for joining BK Live. Nelson Tebbe specializes in questions of constitutional law and religious freedom. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, you guys. Bill, let's start with you. You clerked for Justice Souter back in the day. With your unique insight, what do you think is going on behind the scenes at the Supreme Court right now?
Right. Well, I think one of the things that's likely going on is that clerks are thinking about what are called cert petitions, which are basically applications from parties to have the court hear their cases. A 4-4 court, as you can well imagine, looks very different than a 5-4 court in terms of likely outcomes. And so it's quite likely that clerks, in particular in the conservative justices' chambers, are thinking about which cert petitions they may be interested in pushing forward on the agenda, with the expectation that Judge Gorsuch would be confirmed and take that 9th seat.
Well, 9 seats. We've been functioning with 8 despite some of the Democrats' best efforts. But looking forward, you specialize in religion, and if you are going to be on TV a lot more in the next 4 years with President Trump at the helm, especially as it relates to this justice, particularly a lot of his rulings and opinions on like the Hobby Lobby stuff and these religious freedoms and stuff like right to life. So what do you foresee with the Trump administration and if Justice Gorsuch becomes Justice Gorsuch?
Well, we can expect to see a court that looks on religion questions not too dissimilar from the court that Justice Scalia left in an untimely manner. Judge Gorsuch, and if he becomes Justice Gorsuch, did vote in favor of Hobby Lobby in the lower court. But so would have and did Justice Scalia, right? So I don't think we can expect a huge balance of power shift on those kinds of questions if Justice Gorsuch becomes Justice Gorsuch.
I'm interested in knowing about that power shift. Like, how much pressure do you think any administration feels with sort of respecting the legacy? We had a meeting earlier and called it the Scalias seat. And I took some exception to that because it's not his seat. Right. He was just the guy who occupied it, who didn't watch his diet, and now he's gone. So how much of the balance do you think the politicians are concerned with maintaining or trying to get the court to go a different way?
Well, I think the reality is everyone, every politician, every senator, every president, when they think about a nominee, thinks about who that nominee is replacing, and especially if you're the opposition party. If you're the opposition party, you may be slightly less concerned about a nomination where you have a one-for-one switch-out, basically, of a justice who is appointed by a particular party's president being replaced by a justice appointed by that same party's president, right? So, for example, in 2005, there was somewhat less concern as a political matter when Chief Justice Roberts was when John Roberts was appointed to take Chief Justice Rehnquist's seat, because that was a one-for-one. On the other hand, when Samuel Alito was nominated, same one-for-one on the party side, but Samuel Alito was thought, turns out quite accurately, to have been significantly more conservative than Justice O'Connor. And so that kind of balance shifting is something that I think politicians are deeply aware of, both on the appointing party side, but in particular on the opposition party side.
Can I sneak one more in about the balance thing? Like, we saw Souter when Clarence Thomas got in, how he became a little more, he went more to the middle, he became less conservative. So what do you think what do you think the presumptive new justice would do to the balance and how people shift? Because he's supposed to be he would be very conservative from his previous rulings that we've seen.
Well, by some measures, Judge Gorsuch is more conservative than Justice Scalia. to the degree you can measure that. But one dynamic that's interesting is that Judge Gorsuch clerked for Justice Kennedy. So one hope, at least among some conservatives, is that he would influence his former boss to rule in the more conservative direction in hard cases.
Because he's the swing guy. Like, he can go either way. He's that ninth vote usually.
Yes. I mean, I'll add that in Republican circles, there's a story that's told about Supreme Court justices who, quote unquote, betrayed their conservative roots. Mm-hmm. This goes back really as far as Earl Warren back in the 1950s, who was an Eisenhower appointee, continues on through Harry Blackmun, who was a Nixon appointee, and as you said, culminates in David Souter. All Republican appointees who are eventually seen as far more liberal than they were expected to be. And I think what's happened since then, in particular since Souter, is that Republicans have been deeply careful about vetting their possible nominees. Don't forget, this was the Federalist Society who provided that proverbial list of 21 judges from which President Trump could select. And so it's quite likely that Justice Gorsuch, if he becomes Justice Gorsuch, would not in fact betray those principles. Stay the line. Yeah.
Right, so somebody who did, as you mentioned before, was Alito, right, who then kind of became more conservative, and he was the last person who was filibustered, the one and only at this point. So do we filibuster now, or do we wait for the next nominee? There's a lot of talk about that. What do you guys
also
think?
known as the nuclear option that can be undertaken by Democrats.
Right. So what do you think the Democratic strategy should be now for this pick?
I think that's a hard question facing Democrats, right? They're going to have to ask themselves, do we filibuster Judge Gorsuch? If we do that, will it cause the Republican majority in the Senate to exercise the nuclear option and remove the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees? That might not matter so much the ultimate outcome in this situation, but the next vacancy is the one that could really change the balance of power on the court. And Democrats may be worried that without the filibuster in place, they may want for weapons to use in that situation. My own thought is that they shouldn't worry about that too much because the Republican majority could remove the filibuster at that stage, right?
Right.
But there could be a balance. There could be a shift. I mean, if that vacancy happens after midterm elections, then the balance of power in the Senate may have shifted by the time the next vacancy comes up.
So you think they should storm in and go all the way because they might win back the whole thing anyway?
Well, as Nelson said, it's a politically very fraught and delicate decision to make. I think one thing that hasn't been noted, although you noted in your intro, is that the grassroots of the Democratic Party is in open revolt at this point against Donald Trump. And for the leadership in the Senate to not acknowledge that and to act aggressively with this nomination, I think might in fact be a very perilous course with the party's own base.
Right.
So how much of that do you think is sour grapes left over from the fact that Obama's pick couldn't even walk into the room? No one would meet with him. He couldn't get a proper hearing. And some people are just going to say, oh, we'll take a page from the Republican playbook and just be obstruction. It's like, no, whoever it is, we ain't having it.
Well, what kind of precedent would it set if, Merrick gets stonewalled and then nothing happens now? This is just smooth sailing.
Yes. Look, there's an argument that if you want to restore particular norms of government, like, for example, every nominee gets a vote or at least gets hearings, then you have to engage in tit-for-tat behavior. And so that, in this case, would suggest doing to Gorsuch what the Republicans did to Garland. On the other hand, the counter-argument is, that just blows up the norms even more and makes it impossible for them to be reconstructed at some future point.
One possibility for the Democrats would be, if they want to depoliticize the nomination and confirmation of Supreme Court justices, would be to say, we are going to filibuster this seat because it properly belongs to Judge Garland.
Right.
But on the next vacancy, we'll return to deference, right? So we'll defer to the nominee as long as the nominee is qualified, right? That would be a way of sort of walking the line. But in all likelihood, what we're going to see is further polarization, so that really you see someone seated on the Supreme Court only when the president and the Senate are in the hands of the same party. And that will, over time, the worry is, lead to a Supreme Court that's more polarized than it is today.
So speaking of polarization, I just wonder from your inside view, with the people who are actually doing the work, how much they're influenced by this when you're looking at all of these things, deciding what's going to come and what the court's going to hear, if all of the noise in the Republic gets filtered out, or if it sort of seeps in with what they look at in the cases that come before the court?
Look, I think as far as the clerks are concerned, they are servants of the particular justices for whom they work, and they're supposed to do their jobs. On the other hand, these are by definition smart, young, ambitious people living in Washington, and so of course they can't but help be influenced by what's going on outside the walls. In terms of the justices themselves, I think they tend to take a longer view. I think there is a lot of value placed among the justices on having the court remain as collegial as possible. And so I think there probably is an attempt to shut out the noise. Indeed, since so many of them went through similar processes when they were confirmed, there's probably a lot of sympathy, both for Judge Garland and for Judge Gorsuch now, and a desire to sort of keep that off to the side, in particular once the judge takes a seat on the court.
If Gorsuch is confirmed, what happens to all those decisions that were deadlocked in the past year?
Yeah, do we get a redo on the 4-4 split stuff?
Yeah.
Does that happen? Is there a precedent for that?
Well, it's possible that the parties could try to bring those cases back to the court and hope for a decision that would bind the future.
Yeah.
There are also some cases that the court held off on deciding that were fully briefed, and the court has not scheduled argument. And one has to think that they were doing that, hoping, and waiting for the ninth justice to be seated,
rather than continue in deadlock, which I guess makes sense.
So how much power would he have walking through the door if he's confirmed as the new justice? Does he get to say, oh, you guys heard this, or this has been in the queue? Can we start here? What's the hierarchy? Is there a pecking order or what?
Well, there is a most definite pecking order in terms of how justices speak their minds and vote at conferences. That is done, as far as we know, on a very hierarchical level, seniority-based level. And certainly decisions to hear cases are made collegially. It takes 4 votes to so-called grant cert, that is to say, to agree to hear the case. And so it's not like Justice Gorsuch himself, if he were confirmed, could simply snap his fingers and make those things happen.
Right.
It's tough to be the new guy.
I know.
It's still a good gig.
If we could very quickly go back actually to something that was mentioned a while ago with what's going on with the refugee ban, because I have you here, Nelson, and you do religion and constitutional law. Are we going to be in the courts with this kind of stuff for the next 4 years? Is there any of this that can actually make it through in what he's proposing?
Well, the executive order on immigration and refugees is constitutionally troubling, in my opinion, on religious freedom grounds. And that's true of its 2 main provisions. First, the ban on any immigrants or refugees from 7 countries is troubling on religious freedom grounds, because the courts have said in case after case that they will look at the history of a particular provision to determine whether its purpose is discriminatory on the basis of religion. And here, the history of the Muslim ban, as it was first called and then sort of morphed into this 7-country ban, shows, I think, quite clearly that there's a discriminatory intent behind the 7-country ban. And even if the very same list of 7 countries might have been constitutional in some other context, the court has said we're going to look at the history, right? And the other provision is the prioritization of religious minorities when they bring refugee claims in particular countries. And that preference seems designed to prefer Christians, and then President Trump said in interviews that he sees it also as a preference for Christians. And that kind of sect preference is blatantly unconstitutional. Again, it's the purpose that matters, and also its structure and implementation. And so that's a second problem on religious freedom grounds with the executive order.
So, Professor Araiza, before we get out of here, we saw just a second ago at the beginning of your answer a cartoon that had Lady Liberty on the other side of Trump with the blind justice in the middle now. So I'm wondering, just seeing how things are going with all the challenges to the executive orders and the president in the courts, how you feel about the role of the separation of powers and the role that the judicial system is going to play over the next 4 years.
I think in a system that is supposed to be one of separated powers, and in a system in which one of those institutions, Congress, is really not fulfilling its duties to check the other branch, the president, I think the role of the courts is going to be especially important going forward. And indeed, we've seen from President Trump's attack on Judge Curiel back during the campaign to his description of the judge in Washington State as a so-called judge. I think this is all kind of emblematic of the tensions that are going to continue to exist, I think, throughout the life of this administration between the president on the one hand and the independent judiciary on the other.
We're going to be in court the whole time.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
Thank you so much for joining us, both of you.